Welcome to another Elects webinar on institutional repositories. I'm Pamela Blue, and on behalf of myself and my colleague Cindy Hepfer, we are delighted that we are finally, after several postponements, able to bring you this session on selecting an IR platform. Our presenter today is Bob Gerrity, the Associate University Librarian for Library Systems and Information Technology at Boston College. Bob has a wealth of experience with new technologies, including the introduction of open URL-based reference linking, federated searching, and the library's e-scholarship at BC Digital Repository. He was a speaker at the 2009 Elects Midwinter Symposium on Institutional Repositories, where the title of his presentation was Moving from a Hosted to a Local IR Platform, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The webinar today is based loosely on that earlier presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Bob, and we'll begin.
Okay, thanks, Pamela. So the topic for this afternoon's webinar is, as Pamela said, selecting a platform for your institutional repository. I'm going to spend about 25 minutes running through a PowerPoint presentation and then allow plenty of time for Q&A. The last slide includes a link to a copy of the presentation, so don't worry about writing down anything that's on the slides that you want to refer to later. I'm going to stop for questions about halfway through and then at the end, but certainly feel free to send in a question at any point if you feel you need to, especially if I've said something that isn't clear. The ALA folks said I should include a photo since you can't see me. And I hate to admit it, but this is the best current photo I could come up with, so let's move on. This is the basic agenda for today. I'll talk a little bit about the need to define a clear rationale for and scope of your IR, and about defining the functional and technical requirements. I'll talk generally about some of the IR platform options available, but I want to be clear that I won't be going into a lot of specific detail about or going into any detailed comparison of the different platforms. Another key point I want to make up front is that from my perspective, IRs are not hugely interesting or complex from a technology standpoint. They're much more interesting in terms of offering new ways for academic libraries to develop value-added service for their constituents, and understanding your local context and selecting a platform that best fits that context is the key to selecting the right IR. For the purpose of this discussion, I did want to spend a minute or two on definitions and draw some distinction between IRs and digital repositories. When talking about an institutional repository, I think we generally mean a web-based repository in which scholarly or research material is collected, described, and exposed for discovery. The repository is typically focused on the scholarly or research output of a particular college or university. As we know, IRs grew out of the open access movement and therefore typically require, or at least strongly encourage, deposits of material that can be shared with minimal restrictions. I would categorize institutional repositories as a subset of digital repositories, which are more general purpose systems to facilitate the collection, description, management, preservation, and discovery of digital material, ranging from digitized library special collections to repositories of learning objects. In terms of today's platform discussion, the focus will mainly be on purpose-built IR platforms, but I'll also touch briefly on digital repository platforms more generally that are being used to host IRs. So for those of us who prefer a visual approach, this is a diagram that attempts to describe the attributes of different types of digital repositories. It's the cosmic view of repositories developed by Kerry Blinko and Neil McLean in 2004. Moving from the outward to the inner circles, we have attributes covering scope or affiliation, type of content, life cycle of content, need for curation, access restrictions, and information architecture. If we choose the attributes of the typical institutional repository, we end up with something like this, where the scope of the repository is institutional, the type of the content is scholarly information, the content is persistent and archival, the content is curated to some degree and openly accessible, and so on. If we were to map technology platforms to this space, which I'm not going to attempt to do here, we'd see lots of overlap, systems that potentially accommodate fairly broad slices of the repository pie. And if you do download the presentation later, there is a link to an animated version of this if you want to spin the color wheel and see what other types of repositories look like in this space. As I mentioned before, IRs are not mainly about technology. Before you can determine what the right platform is for your institution, you really need a clear and shared understanding of why you want an IR in the first place. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to increase the profile of the library, replace or improve an existing system or service, respond to faculty demand for a place to deposit their work? Is there a campus mandate for such a system? The answers to questions like this will help you create the right context for selecting the best IR platform. Assuming that one of the primary goals of your IR is to highlight and make widely accessible the output of your faculty, I think it's critical to approach the issue of selecting an appropriate platform with an understanding of what faculty actually want. I'd highly recommend as background reading on this question a piece that Susan Gibbons and Nancy Foster from Rochester published in DLib a few years ago. Their study of faculty work practices at Rochester revealed some interesting disconnects between the value and role of the IR from the library's perspective versus a system that faculty would actually find useful in supporting their research and publications. So here's part of what they found at Rochester. Substitute any IR platform for DSpace here. DSpace happens to be the IR platform that was in place at the time at Rochester, but the attributes mentioned are common to most or all IR platforms. The green represents a high level of fit between faculty desires and system features. The red indicates gaps. So, for example, the term institutional repository doesn't seem to resonate with faculty, nor do they care about metadata or about whether the IR is open source or not. So here's part of what they found at Rochester. Oh, sorry, wrong slide. What did faculty want? Here's a list of the key elements that they found at the Rochester study. Take particular note of the last item, not be any busier. A key component of a successful IR is that it doesn't impose any significant time burden on faculty to participate. An extension of the why question is to determine, if you haven't already, what the scope of the repository will be in terms of content and contributors. Beyond textual material, articles, preprints, postprints, working papers, conference proceedings, ETDs, etc., what other types of material need to be accommodated in your repository? Data sets, stream media, and who will be allowed to contribute or deposit? Everyone affiliated with the institution or only those in certain roles? Will the library define this, or will policies be determined by communities within the repository? So keeping in mind that what you're looking for in an IR platform should take into account the needs of the audiences you're serving, let's look at the typical key functional areas of most IR platforms. Broadly speaking, IRs typically include the following: a self-service web-based submission or deposit module for IR contributors, a module for content owners, administrators to review submissions, edit metadata, and approve content for publication. Then there's the public IR site with search options and the ability to navigate to content by logical hierarchies, and the back-end administrative module with tools for creating communities, collections, and publication series, for reporting, for data import and export, etc. We'll look at each of these individually. The approach I'm taking here is to try and outline key questions you'll want answers to as you evaluate the options for your IR platform. As I said earlier, the right platform depends on your local priorities. So for submission and deposit, some key questions to ask in evaluating systems. First, can the system interface in a secure manner with your campus identity management system? Apart from identifying campus users, is there a need to get additional attributes from the campus system, such as the user status, address, email, departmental affiliation, etc.? Second, and probably most important, is the submission workflow simple and easy for end users? Does the system support different workflows for different categories of depositors and/or different types of submissions? Third, related to ease of submission, does the system offer conversion utilities for contributors to facilitate a common publishing format within the IR, or will users need to do their own conversion? Continuing on with the review and publication process, is it easy to set up and administer reviewer or approver accounts in the system? Do you have any special local requirements about how granular the permissions or privileges need to be for these accounts? Does the system provide automatic notifications to reviewers of work that needs to be done? Are publication embargoes allowed and easy to administer? So we know that faculty don't care about metadata, but we know that as librarians, most of us do. And we know that metadata is critical to enabling control and discovery of information. Some of the key metadata questions to consider as you're looking at IR platforms include what metadata formats are supported, what metadata is required, and what control do you have over what's required and what's not. Is authority control available, for example, to determine the appropriate forms of authors or publishers' names? Can you use controlled vocabularies? Can you set up selection lists to minimize the amount of keyboarding that depositors will have to do? And does the system provide any automatic correction or other quality control mechanisms? Moving on to the public interface, what kinds of indexing and search options are available for users? Assuming there's full text indexing and keyword searching, does the system offer the capability for browse searching as well? Can you expose the content of your IR to external search engines, such as Google Scholar or via OAI harvesting? And can the content of the repository be organized and, more importantly, reorganized easily as you go forward? Last slide on functional requirements. On the administrative end, what types of reporting does the system offer for both staff and for end users? Does the system support flexible export and import procedures? Does it provide the ability for administrators to do global edits of metadata? What APIs are available for the system to support building connections with other campus systems or to support local add-ons? Does the system support the OAI PMH protocol? Is it easy to add your local branding to the IR? What extra features are available, such as the ability to generate individualized pages for faculty? So lots of questions to ask as you look at different options. Before I move on to the technical requirements, are there any burning questions so far about what I've talked about? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so we'll continue. On to defining technical requirements. From a technical standpoint, the options for IR platforms are fairly straightforward. I think the most important first step in defining technical requirements is to first determine what local constraints exist that may limit your choices for better or for worse. For example, are there any local policies or standards in place that mandate a particular hardware platform or operating system or database platform for your IR? For example, here at Boston College, our campus ITS department prefers IBM servers running Linux, and for database applications, strongly prefers Oracle as a database platform of choice. If we're adding a system that they'll be hosting, we need to follow their recommendations or make a strong case for the need to do something different. They're also extremely concerned about security, and for any system we want to implement that needs to connect to BC's identity management system or to other local data stores, we need to go through an auditing process to make sure that the system we're proposing and the connection to their systems has appropriate security controls and mechanisms in place. Are there rules suggesting or requiring that a repository, institutional repository that hosts the intellectual output of the university be hosted locally, or that open source is preferred over commercial software? I'm somewhat agnostic myself about the open source versus commercial debate. I think from this slide, which is from Mark Sutherland and Peta Hopkins at Bond University, you can get a snapshot of what are the key differences are between OS, open source, and commercial or off-the-shelf software. But I'm not actually going to spend time going through this now. If you've been involved in open source debate at your institution, you'll know what the issues are. I think the more important technical requirements relate to how much localization or customization you want for your IR and to what degree the IR platform supports relevant standards and protocols. If you're expecting to do significant customization of your IR, then you'll want to make sure that the platform allows that, either because the platform is open through documented APIs that local developers can hook into, or because the vendor, if it's a commercial system, offers customization options. Key standards and protocols for IRs are those that ensure that it's easy to put data into your IR for example, the SWORD protocol, and that once there, the data can be made available to other systems for harvesting and discovery, for example, OAI PMH, and then material in your IR can be assigned permanent locations on the net, which will work even if the actual content moves, such as the handle system. A couple of local examples here at BC. We want the repository to be accessible not only from within the discovery layer of the repository platform, but also in our main library discovery system and beyond. Because our IR supports the OAI protocol, we can easily harvest records from the IR into our main discovery system, and we can also make the data available to other repositories. The IR also supports the site index protocol that Google Scholar uses, so our content is discoverable there as well. And once users find the content in our IR that's of interest to them, because the system supports the handle system, we're able to give users a URL to the content that is both short and that will persist, even if we move the content somewhere else in the future. So moving on to identifying and evaluating options for your IR platform. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this site. This is Repository 66. And sites like this are a good way to begin looking at the available IR platforms and seeing them in action. Repository 66 is built on one of the public directories of open access repositories. And I'm actually going to spend a couple of minutes here and go into Repository 66 and show you what it looks like. One caveat, as I've discovered myself, the data in here is not entirely accurate, but I think it does give you a sense of what repositories are being used where. And so we see over on the right the totals for Repository 66, giving you a sense of the adoption rate for some of the different platforms. And we have the ability to navigate into a particular geographic area and get more information about repositories in place in your neighborhood. So for example, I'm honing in on Massachusetts here. And can get a quick snapshot of what systems are in place. And if I hover over a particular bubble, I can see what the repository is, in this case, eScholarship at Amherst. And click on it to get a little bit more information, and they also provide links to the repositories themselves. So if you haven't done this already, I think this is a great way to begin to see, one, the adoption rates of the different platforms, and then you can actually go look at the implementations and get a better sense of how they're being used and whether what they're doing might be applicable in your situation. Also, obviously, the developers of the IR platforms themselves provide a lot of useful information as you begin to look at the different options. And so here I've just listed a few of the more prevalent platforms with links to their websites. The DSpace and Fedora Commons are now administered under the DuraSpace initiative. So if you go to DuraSpace, you'll actually find information about both Fedora Commons and about DSpace. The kind of new entry on this list is next to the last one, IR Plus, which is a recently developed platform out of Rochester, open source, actually building on some of the work that they did at Rochester about what features faculty would find of use in repositories. So they developed a brand new IR platform that you can find out more about. Some other resources that are helpful in determining what options are out there and what might be most appropriate for you. SPARC, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, has lots of information both describing available options for IR platforms and also, once you do have your IR in place, they provide lots of great marketing and other kinds of materials to develop your IR program. Also, Charles Bailey has a nice bibliography on institutional repositories in general, but it does include a separate section on IR platforms. There are the registries where open access repositories can create records describing their implementation, so those are a useful source of information. And as I said, the Directory of Open Access Repositories is actually the basis for that visual map, the Repository 66. So more background reading there. So when it comes to actually making a choice, this slide may seem a little minimalist for good reason. I don't have a magic checklist for choosing the right IR platform for your environment. And even if I did, I've seen the way system selection works at enough institutions to know that it's never simply a matter of putting together a list of the right functional and technical requirements and expecting that the right choice will emerge and have unanimous support. I do think the more background work you've done or will do on understanding what features will be important and of interest to your target audience, the easier it will be to identify which platforms are most likely to meet your needs as you look at the available options. It's also critical that ownership issues for your IR be discussed upfront and frankly. What department or group is responsible for your IR program? Who will be providing local technical support? And how does their skill set match the platform options you're considering? So I'm actually going to end at this point and hope that I've at least given you some good questions to ask and identified some additional resources to pursue. And at this point, it would be great if we could delve deeper into some specific areas that are particularly interesting or of concern to you. So let's go ahead and open up for questions and discussions. Do we have any questions so far? I'm not seeing any here. I see a hand raised, but somebody help me with that? Okay, I see a couple of questions here now. One is, I'm looking for some sample consensus forms for me to get some ideas. Any suggestions? I'm not quite sure what that question means, so if the person who asked it could maybe expand a little bit, that would be helpful. Another question, could you address the total cost factors of the main contenders for IR platforms? So let's go back and look at the few that I listed. Sorry. Hold on one second. Here. So the ones I've listed here, the only commercial one, the only non-open source is Digital Commons. So obviously the business model for that is different from the others. At least the last time I checked, essentially you pay the vendor an annual subscription cost for access to the software, and they obviously provide all the hosting and back-end services and technical support. For the open source systems, obviously the software is quote-unquote free, but you've got to provide the local infrastructure, server, and the support for that server, as well as more in the way of technical support to get the system up and running and to support it on an ongoing basis. And obviously those costs depend to a large degree on to what degree you can take the system out of the box and how much customization you want to do. So your local support costs will increase the more you want to customize the system for your needs. The sort of outlier here, I think, is in terms of the open source options would be Fedora Commons, which really is a back-end system and doesn't provide the out-of-the-box discovery layer that the others do. So I think in general Fedora would be for larger institutions that have the technical resources to do that additional development work. Another question, are you aware of any institutions or platforms that are grabbing faculty data from banner or digital measures? I am not. We're just starting to use digital measures here at Boston College, and we've had conversations with a couple of academic departments who are the test cases for the implementation of digital measures. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to harvest faculty publication data from digital measures, but we haven't actually done it yet. And we did have some conversations with the digital measures people, and they weren't able to provide us with reference sites or examples of other places where this was taking place. But it would seem to be a good possibility to try to leverage that work as a way to bring data into the repository. Why isn't Content DM on your list? Content DM certainly could be on the list. Digitool could be on the list as well. Personally, I view Content DM in that broader digital repository category. I think generally it's used more for library special collections than for IRs, but that's certainly not to say that it isn't or couldn't be used for IRs. So I'll certainly add that. In general, apart from IR+, which is new, the list comprises the ones that seem to be most widely adopted based on the registry data that I had. Okay, back to the question I didn't understand. Consensus forms for authors to fill out. For the library staff to create digital copies of students' theses, we need to ensure that we're not violating copyright laws. So I'm not aware of the details of what forms and templates for forms are available in these particular platforms. I know from the repository we work with here at Boston College, which is Digitool, there are some basic forms available as part of those submission workflows, but we edited those pretty heavily and worked with our campus council to come up with language that best suited our environment. And generally that was a fairly trivial task to modify the form templates to reflect our local requirements. So I would suspect that that would be similar for most of the platforms, that there's some out-of-the-box submission forms covering that you can easily modify to suit your local environment. Another question, what is the role of social and networked learning with the current crop of IR solutions? Are there best practices? I think I probably need a little bit of clarification on what this question is as well, if Teresa could provide that. Do you know of any good hosted solutions? Costs? So I mentioned Digital Commons as a hosted solution. I can't provide you with cost, but I know Digital Commons, bpress, would be happy to provide you with cost estimates. So I think that's pretty easy to find out, but I wouldn't want to venture into the pricing territory. Smaller libraries who don't have a budget for the commercial platforms and technical resources for the open source platforms. So what should they do? Well, there's a good question. You know, I think some of the open source platforms, and based on my recent look, I would probably put ePrints and DSpace as well into this category, really don't require a huge amount of technical expertise or even hardware resources to get up and running on a pilot basis. So, you know, if you're really committed to doing this, I don't think that should necessarily be a barrier. If you could do a small pilot project with one of the open source platforms that demonstrated that this was a project of use and use that as a way to get a budget to make it a larger implementation and get the right kinds of support, that might be one approach. Can you talk a little about DuraSpace and DuraCloud? I'm afraid that I can't. I only have a very basic understanding of those initiatives. Okay, back to the social networking. Do any of the current crop of IRs allow social networking, or is it something that needs to be built as a bolt-on to the solution? I'm not aware of any real social networking add-ons to the current solutions. But I know, say in the case of us at BC, we've done a lot of local development of those kinds of things, and because the systems we're using are open and have the APIs that we're used to working with, it tends not to be a huge task to do that. Okay, I'm just going through. I'm not seeing additional questions. Okay, here's one. Are you aware of integration efforts with e-portfolio systems like Mahara? No, I am not. I will actually, since there have been a few here that I don't have answers to, go back to these later and contact you, assuming I can get your contact information from the ALA folks. And I have a comment here, FYI, some in-house developed IR have social networking features and allow the general public to comment on the collections. We actually have that. I mentioned that we're harvesting the metadata from our IR, depositing it in our in the library general discovery system, which does have comment features. So while we don't have it in the IR proper, we do have those social networking features enabled in our primary discovery system. Any more questions? Okay, I'm not hearing any or seeing any.
Bob, thank you very, very much for your excellent overview of the many questions that need to be asked to determine what the best platform is to choose. I think we've discovered, based on your presentation and the discussion, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for an institutional repository, and the decision of which platform to adopt is based on many factors and local conditions. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form, and I hope you will take a few moments to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are important and help the Elect CE Committee to plan additional continuing education offerings on the topic of institutional repositories, as well as on other subjects. Information about additional presentations in the IR series, as well as Elect's webinars on other topics, are featured on the Elect's homepage. CE events are continually being developed, so check the Elect's homepage frequently for new information, and if you have a suggestion for an Elect's webinar or other continuing education opportunity, please contact me or Cindy Hepfer. Our email addresses are, you can find them on the Elect's page. To submit a proposal for a webinar using the form that's also listed on your screen at the moment. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Carrie and members of the technical subcommittee of the CE Committee for providing technical support for today's webinar, and also many thanks to Berkeley Electronic Press for supporting the entire series of webinars on institutional repositories. We sincerely hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and that you will continue to explore topics on institutional repositories with us again during our next session on April the 28th, when Sharon Farr, Bonnie Tijerina, and Catherine Mitchell will discuss the consortial campus view, reinventing the IR from all directions. And with that, I bid you a good afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.